Marcus Ellison once knew what it meant to command a room without saying a word. He was the kind of man whose name echoed in boardrooms long before he arrived. When Marcus walked into a meeting, the air shifted, voices softened, eyes followed, and deals bent to his will. He had built his empire from scraps, rising from a childhood of hand-me-down shoes and second-hand books to become one of the most respected black entrepreneurs in the city. His story had been celebrated in magazines, studied in classrooms, whispered about by men who dreamed of walking his path. He had the mansion on the hill with floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the skyline. He had the cars polished so sharply they seemed carved from mirrors. He had the wife, too, beautiful, camera-ready, always smiling at his side at galas and interviews. To the world, they were the perfect pair, an unstoppable power couple who stood as proof of success and love wrapped into one glossy picture. But perfection has cracks, and sometimes those cracks split without warning. The divorce began quietly, the way storms sometimes gather on the horizon without anyone noticing. Then, in one single headline, everything he had built collapsed. His wife stepped into the spotlight, not as his partner anymore, but as his accuser. She spoke of nights filled with rage, of bruises hidden beneath designer gowns, of a husband whose success, she claimed, had poisoned him with cruelty. She cried on camera. She told her story to reporters who scribbled every word as though it were scripture. Marcus denied it. He shouted the truth at first, standing tall in front of microphones, insisting he had never laid a hand on her. But the world doesn't wait for proof. It waits for spectacle. And a black man accused of violence against his wife was a headline too sharp, too sensational to resist. The tabloids called him a monster before the show. Ertz even opened. Investors pulled out overnight. Contracts vanished in days. Even men who once toasted him with champagne now refused to answer his calls. He watched his empire disintegrate in real time. Office towers with his name on the lease were stripped bare by lawyers. Cars that once turned heads were sold off for pennies at auctions. His mansion on the hill sat dark, its windows hollow, while journalists camped outside to photograph him leaving for court. But the worst loss wasn't the money. It was the silence of those he once trusted. Friends he had known for decades walked past him in hallways as though they had never met. His business partners, men whose fortunes he had helped build, suddenly had nothing to say. Even the doorman at his office avoided eye contact, pretending Marcus was just another stranger on the street. Courtrooms became his prison. Every session was another theater, packed with onlookers waiting to see the mighty man reduced to ash. He sat there, jaw tight, hands clenched, watching as his wife's lawyers painted him into a monster he didn't recognize. He tried to defend himself, but each word sounded weaker, smaller, drowned out by her rehearsed tears and trembling voice. And when the final ruling came down, it was as though the gavel struck straight through his chest. Property gone, accounts frozen, his reputation gutted. That evening, Marcus carried a single cardboard box out of the building that once bore his name. Inside were scraps of a life, a wristwatch he couldn't pawn for half its worth, a stack of unpaid bills, and a bank slip showing the only thing the world had left him, $500. $500, that was it. He stepped out into the street, and for the first time in years, no one turned to admire him. The city lights flickered above, but they no longer felt like his. As he walked, two men outside a cafe leaned down and whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "Isn't that the one who hit his wife?" "Yeah, shame. I used to respect him." Marcus clenched his jaw, stuffing his hands into his pockets, fighting the urge to scream. He wanted to shout that it was all a lie, that the truth had been twisted, that he was not the monster she painted him to be. But he didn't, because he knew no one would listen. That night, Marcus stood in front of a mirror in a cheap motel room, staring at the reflection that stared back at him. He didn't see the powerful entrepreneur who once ruled boardrooms. He saw a man stripped of his name, a rumor wrapped in skin, and as the silence pressed against his chest, he whispered to himself, almost afraid of the sound of his own voice. This is all that's left. Marcus Ellison sat in the driver's seat of a car that wasn't his, staring out at the rain-soaked city with the same numb expression he had worn for weeks. The world had taken everything he thought was permanent, folded it in half, and tossed it into the fire. He had signed the papers, left the court with a cardboard box under his arm, and now there was nothing but silence. When men lose, they usually lose in small pieces, a job here, a friendship there, a love that quietly fades. But Marcus had lost all at once, like someone ripped the floor from under him and he was still falling. He spent the nights in a rented one-room apartment that smelled of dust and rust, the kind of place where no one asked questions because no one cared. The walls were thin enough for him to hear a baby crying down the hall and a couple fighting 3 doors over. Sometimes he turned the radio up just to drown out life itself. Days blurred. The phone never rang. The men who used to shake his hand at conferences now crossed the street when they saw him. His name was Poison. His face, once in magazines, was now a warning sign. Marcus tried to distract himself by walking aimlessly. He wandered into neighborhoods he had never visited before, or streets lined with pawn shops, thrift stores, and old garages that smelled of oil and forgotten dreams. One afternoon, while ducking out of a sudden downpour, he found himself beneath the awning of a small, dust-covered dealership on the edge of town. The sign was half broken, letters missing, but the glass windows displayed something that stopped him cold. A vintage car, polished under the dim lights, its chrome grille gleaming despite the rain streaks on the glass. It was a 1937 Cadillac Fleetwood, black body, sweeping fenders, white wall tires that looked like they'd rolled straight out of history. Even through the glass, Marcus felt it, something alive, something proud. He stepped inside, half out of curiosity, half out of desperation for warmth. The air smelled of leather and engine oil. Behind the desk sat an old man with skin like parchment and eyes sharp as steel. He looked Marcus up and down and said nothing, just slid the keys across the counter with a nod, as if he had been expecting him. Marcus frowned. "I'm not here to buy, just looking." The man leaned forward. "Some cars choose their owner. You'll know when it's time." Marcus should have laughed. He should have walked out. But instead, his hand brushed the Cadillac's hood, and something in him stirred. A memory of long drives with his father, the smell of cologne and motor oil, the sound of jazz pouring out of an old radio. For the first time in months, Marcus felt something more than shame. When the old man told him the price, Marcus's heart twisted. It was more than he could afford, but less than the car was worth. Almost like fate had discounted destiny just for him. With trembling hands, Marcus handed over most of what he had left, nearly every dollar from the $500 he'd walked out of court with. He should have been terrified. Instead, when he slid into the driver's seat of that Cadillac, something changed. The wheel was cold, the leather cracked, but the moment he turned the key, the engine roared to life with a sound deep enough to shake his chest. For the first time in months, Marcus Ellison smiled. That night, he parked the Cadillac outside his apartment building and sat there long after midnight, staring at the reflection of streetlights on the hood. He didn't know why he had bought it. He didn't know what it meant, but he felt something undeniable. The car wasn't just a machine, it was a beginning. The nights were the hardest. Marcus Ellison would slip into the driver's seat of the Cadillac after long days of meaningless labor, shutting the door against a world that no longer had space for him. The car smelled of old leather and dust, but it gave him something he hadn't felt in weeks: shelter. The heavy doors sealed out the noise, the whispers, the shame. Inside, he wasn't a fallen man. He was just a man with an engine that still ran. By day, he worked jobs that once would have made him sneer: dock shifts, carrying crates for men half his age, sweeping floors in a mechanic's garage where he wasn't allowed to touch the real tools. Sometimes he caught people staring. Some recognized him, eyes narrowing as though watching a once great king turned beggar. Others just saw another tired black man, shoulders bent under invisible weight. The whispers followed him everywhere. "Isn't that him, the one from the papers? Yeah, the one who beat his wife. Look at him now. Guess he got what was coming." Every time he heard it, Marcus wanted to scream, wanted to tell them the truth, to shout until his throat tore. But he swallowed the fire. Words were useless now. In their eyes, he was guilty, and guilt doesn't need proof. It just needs a story people want to believe. At night, he returned to the Cadillac. Sometimes he didn't even bother with the apartment anymore. The car felt safer, more private. He would recline the cracked leather seat, close his eyes, and let the sound of rain on the roof lull him to sleep. But the car had secrets. It started with something small. Each time he shifted in the seat, he felt a strange pressure against his back, like there was something solid buried deep beneath the leather. At first, he thought it was just the springs or the frame poking through after years of wear. But one night, half asleep, his hand slid between the torn seams, and his fingers brushed against something hard. It wasn't metal, not the kind of sharp cold you'd expect from broken steel. It was smooth, heavy, almost like a stone. Marcus pulled his hand back, unsettled. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just his imagination. But the thought lingered, gnawed at him. What was hidden inside this car? The next morning, he told himself to ignore it. He had real problems: rent, food, work. The Cadillac was just a car, a place to rest his head when the world got too loud. Still, when he leaned back into the seat that night, he felt it again, that lump pressing into his spine like a secret begging to be uncovered. He began to wonder about the car's history. Who had owned it before? Why had it been sitting there in that forgotten dealership waiting for someone like him to claim it? He remembered the old man's words. Some cars choose their owner. The more he thought about it, the more restless he became. One evening, after a shift hauling boxes at the dock, Marcus sat in the Cadillac with the engine off, staring at the torn seam in the seat. His hands trembled. He wanted to rip it open, to see what lay hidden inside, but fear stopped him. Fear of hope. Fear that maybe, just maybe, this car was more than it seemed, and if it wasn't, then he'd be left with nothing but the same hollow emptiness. So he waited. Night after night, he pressed his back against that mysterious weight, feeling it there, silent and unyielding, like the ghost of a promise. Marcus didn't know it yet, but the Cadillac wasn't just a shelter, it was a vault. And soon, it would change everything. The night Marcus Ellison finally gave in to curiosity, the air outside was thick with summer heat, the kind that clung to your skin and made every breath feel heavy. He sat in the Cadillac, windows down, staring at the torn seam in the driver's seat. The street was quiet, shadows stretching long under the glow of a flickering street lamp. He had resisted for weeks. That lump pressing into his back every night had become almost familiar, like an unwanted guest he had learned to live with. But something in him broke that evening. Maybe it was the way his stomach growled after another skipped dinner. Maybe it was the humiliation of counting coins for gas. Or maybe it was just the unbearable weight of silence that finally pushed him past the edge. His hands shook as he dug his fingers into the split leather. At first, the seam resisted, threads snapping one by one like brittle bones. Then, with a harsh rip, the fabric gave way. A puff of dust rose into the air, and Marcus coughed, eyes watering. He reached inside. His fingers brushed against cloth, something wrapped, something out of place. The fabric felt old, rough, and tied tight. His pulse quickened. For a moment, he froze. What if it was nothing? What if he was tearing apart the only thing he had left, all for some broken spring or forgotten tool? But his gut told him different. He pulled harder, tugging until the bundle came free. It was heavy. He dropped it on the passenger seat, staring at it in the dim light. A lump wrapped in faded burlap, edges frayed from time. His heart pounded as he untied the knots with trembling hands. The cloth peeled back, and what lay inside caught the streetlight just right, a muted gleam, dull, yellow, not brass, not copper, something denser, something that seemed to carry weight beyond its size. Marcus blinked, disbelief washing over him. He ran his thumb across the surface. Cool. Smooth. Solid. Gold, he whispered. At first, he didn't believe it. It couldn't be. Things like this didn't happen. Not to men like him, not at the bottom. But the longer he stared, the more real it became. The bar fit perfectly in his hands, thick and silent. A piece of history that had been hiding beneath him all along. His mind spun. If it was real, if it was truly gold, this could change everything. He could eat without worrying about every dollar. He could pay rent. He could breathe again. But a darker thought crept in. Why was it here? Who hid it? The Cadillac suddenly felt less like a shelter and more like a puzzle. What other secrets did it hold? Unable to contain himself, Marcus wrapped the bar back in the cloth and tucked it under his arm. He drove through the night, streets empty, until he reached a pawn shop that stayed open late, its neon sign buzzing faintly. The man behind the counter raised an eyebrow as Marcus set the bundle down. "Tell me this isn't brass," Marcus said, his voice low, urgent. The man unwrapped it, weighed it, tested it with acid, and then looked up, eyes wide. "Pure. 24 karat. Where'd you get this?" Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. As he walked back to the Cadillac with the bundle hidden under his coat, a strange mix of emotions coursed through him. Shock, fear, disbelief, and something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. That night, lying in the back seat of the Cadillac, Marcus didn't sleep. He kept the gold bar beside him, staring at it as though it might vanish by morning. He knew one thing for certain: his life wasn't over. The Cadillac wasn't just a car, it was a vault of secrets, and he had only just begun to unlock it. Marcus Ellison woke before dawn, the sky outside still painted in shades of navy blue. The gold bar sat on the passenger seat beside him, its dull gleam catching the faintest sliver of light. He hadn't slept. Every time his eyes closed, he'd jolt awake, terrified it would vanish, as though this strange miracle had been nothing more than a cruel dream. He had held empires in his hands before, signed contracts worth millions, shaken the hands of governors, senators, CEOs. Yet nothing felt as heavy, as electric, as that single bar of gold wrapped in burlap. Marcus knew better than to rush. Men who stumble upon sudden fortune and grab at it too eagerly end up devoured by it. He thought about every lesson he had learned in the boardrooms, every ounce of discipline it took to build an empire from scratch. So he planned, quietly, carefully. The next morning he walked into the same pawn shop, but this time he didn't bring the whole bar. He brought a sliver, filed off the edge during a restless night. The man behind the counter tested it, offered cash, and Marcus walked out with just enough to buy food, fill his tank, and cover a week's rent. For the first time in months, he ate breakfast without counting every coin. Eggs, toast, coffee, simple, ordinary things that tasted like heaven. Sitting in the corner of a diner, he caught his reflection in the window. His face was still tired, lined with sleepless nights, but for the first time since the trial, there was something in his eyes again. A spark. The gold became his secret weapon. Piece by piece, he sold tiny fragments, never enough to draw attention. He stashed the rest back inside the Cadillac, beneath the seat where it had slept for decades. He carried himself differently now. The whispers didn't pierce as deeply. The stares didn't cut as sharp. He was no longer a man drowning. He was a man with a rope in his hands, climbing, one careful knot at a time. With his savings growing, Marcus made a decision that startled even him. He rented a shuttered garage on the edge of town, a place that smelled of grease and neglect. The paint was peeling, the floors cracked, but when he stepped inside, he saw potential. "This is where it starts again," he murmured. He poured himself into it, cleaned the floors, painted the walls, bought tools secondhand. At first he had no customers. Who would trust a man whose name had been dragged through mud? But Marcus knew cars. He had loved them since he was a boy, watching his father tune engines in their driveway with nothing but grit and intuition. The first customer came by chance, a delivery driver with a busted belt and no money for repairs. Marcus fixed it for half the price, working late into the night with sweat dripping from his brow. Word spread, slowly, quietly, but it spread. "Ellison's garage," people began to say. "Man knows what he's doing." One job became two became 10. Soon, men who had once crossed the street to avoid him now pulled into his garage, shaking his hand, grateful for his work. He didn't talk much, he didn't brag, he just fixed their cars, took their money, and nodded politely. Every bolt tightened, every engine tuned, rebuilt not just the vehicles, but his own name. Yet beneath the surface, the Cadillac haunted him. Each night after locking the garage, Marcus sat in the old car, staring at its dashboard, running his hands across the worn leather. He couldn't shake the feeling that the single gold bar was just the beginning, that the car was hiding more, whispering secrets through its seams. The old man at the dealership had said, "Some cars choose their owner." Marcus was beginning to believe him, because this car hadn't just given him shelter, it had given him a second life, and something deep inside told him, and the Cadillac still had more to reveal. Marcus Ellison was no longer invisible. The garage that once echoed with emptiness now rang with the sound of wrenches, engines, and conversation. Word had spread through the neighborhood, quietly at first, then with certainty, that Ellison's garage was different. Cars left running smoother, stronger. Marcus didn't cheat, didn't cut corners. He charged fair prices and gave honest work. People began to look him in the eye again. Some even shook his hand with respect. It was slow, steady, but to Marcus it felt like oxygen. After months of suffocating under shame, every satisfied customer was another breath. Still, at night, when the garage doors closed and the hum of engines faded, he sat in the Cadillac, running his hands across its steering wheel like it was a living thing. He couldn't escape the thought. The gold bar he found couldn't have been the only one. Cars didn't swallow fortune by accident. The Cadillac had a story, and it was buried in its bones. But even as Marcus wrestled with that mystery, another truth began to stir outside the garage. Whispers. Not the cruel kind that had chased him since the divorce, but whispers of doubt. This time, about her, his ex-wife. It started as a rumor he overheard while waiting in line at the bank. Two women behind him spoke in low voices. "You hear about her?" one said. "Her story doesn't add up." "Yeah, the neighbor testified, said she never saw a thing, said the bruises looked painted on." Marcus froze, his pulse raced. He tried not to turn, not to show any reaction, but the words burrowed into him like sparks in dry grass. Over the next weeks, more whispers reached him. A mechanic who brought in parts leaned against the counter and muttered, "They're saying her lawyer doctored photos." A customer waiting for his car scrolled through his phone, shaking his head. Whole thing's starting to look fishy. Wouldn't Sura prize me if she made it all up? Marcus said nothing. He didn't defend himself, didn't gloat. He had learned silence could be a shield as much as a punishment. But inside, something heavy began to lift. For months, he had carried the weight of being a villain in a story he hadn't written. Now, for the first time, cracks appeared in that lie. And yet, he didn't chase it. He didn't run to clear his name in headlines. He didn't point fingers or demand apologies. He kept his head down and kept working. If the truth wanted to rise, it would rise on its own. But the Cadillac wouldn't let him rest. One night, after a long day at the garage, Marcus leaned back in its seat and closed his eyes. The air was cool, the streets quiet. His hand brushed along the underside of the dashboard, and he felt something strange, a faint groove carved into the metal. He clicked on a flashlight and leaned closer. Numbers. Tiny etched numbers. Worn, but legible. Serial numbers. Marcus sat frozen. He had seen enough in his days of business to know what they meant. Bank numbers, codes, something official, something dangerous. The gold wasn't random. It wasn't a lost trinket or forgotten stash. This Cadillac had once carried something far greater, something meant to be hidden, smuggled, or forgotten. His heart pounded as a thought bloomed in his mind, one that chilled him even as it thrilled him. The bar he found might only be the beginning. And if the Cadillac was indeed a vault, then somewhere inside its bones still slept a fortune. The garage smelled of oil and steel as Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow. The Cadillac parked before him like a sleeping beast. By now, fixing cars for others had put steady money in his pocket, but the Cadillac, that was different. It wasn't just a car to him anymore. It was a mystery, a partner, a guardian of secrets. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The serial numbers he found carved into the dashboard haunted him. He had traced them onto paper, stared at them under the dim lamp in his small office, and tried to make sense of them. They didn't match any manufacturer codes. These weren't parts numbers. They were deliberate. Someone had carved them to be found, but only by someone who knew where to look. So Marcus decided he would restore the Cadillac, not just polish the chrome or fix its engine, but strip it down to its bones. Piece by piece, he would uncover its past. For weeks, every spare hour was spent on the car. He pulled apart the seats, removed the panels, traced every inch of wiring and frame. The work was grueling, his fingers raw, but it filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his Empire days. And then, one night just past midnight, he found it. Behind the lining of the trunk, beneath a false panel that had rusted nearly shut, his crowbar hit something solid. He pried it open, heart hammering. Inside lay another bundle wrapped in the same coarse burlap as before. He pulled it out with trembling hands. Gold. Not one bar, not two, but 5. His knees nearly buckled. He sat back against the bumper, chest heaving, staring at the treasure laid across the floor like relics of another world. The weight of it all pressed against him, not just the metal, but the realization. Whoever had owned this Cadillac before had used it to smuggle a fortune that had somehow, against all odds, fallen into his hands. Marcus laughed, half in disbelief, half in exhaustion. The sound echoed in the empty garage. For the first time since his fall, he felt more than survival. He felt power again. Not the greedy kind that came with glass towers and boardrooms, but a raw, primal surge, the power of possibility. But with it came fear. If this car had carried gold once, who else knew? Who else had touched it, driven it, hidden things within it? He looked over his shoulder at the dark corners of the garage, suddenly certain someone could be watching. In the days that followed, Marcus grew more cautious. He sold nothing, not this time. Instead, he hid the bars, locking them in a steel case beneath the garage floorboards. He worked as usual, smiling at customers, tuning engines, but his mind was never far from the Cadillac. At night, he sat behind the wheel, running his fingers along the grooves of the steering wheel, whispering like the car could hear him. "You carried secrets long before me, but why me? Why now?" The Cadillac, silent and stoic, offered no answers, but Marcus could feel it. The story wasn't finished. And deep inside, he knew the gold was only part of what the car had been hiding all these years. The Cadillac sat in the center of the garage like a cathedral of secrets. Its black body gleamed under the fluorescent lights, each curve reflecting the hours Marcus had poured into restoring it. To anyone else, it was just a vintage car, rare, beautiful, valuable, but Marcus knew better. This machine was a coffin of history, and he was prying it open piece by piece. The discovery of 5 gold bars had changed everything. His life was no longer about mere survival. Each bar he touched reminded him that fate had not abandoned him. It had simply hidden itself in the shadows, waiting for him to be ready. Yet with fortune came unease. Marcus had started noticing things. A man lingering across the street too long, a black sedan parked outside 2 nights in a row, customers who asked too many questions about the Cadillac, eyes lingering on it like vultures circling prey. He told himself it was paranoia, but deep down, he knew better. The car's history wasn't dead, it was alive, and something, or someone, was still attached to it. Late one evening, Marcus sat in the driver's seat, fingers tracing the steering wheel. He remembered the numbers etched into the dashboard, the hidden compartments, the burlap wrapping. Whoever had hidden the gold had done so with precision. This wasn't some bootlegger's relic. It was organized, calculated. He pulled out an old notebook from his desk and began tracing the numbers again. A thought struck him. What if these weren't just serials? He copied them into rows, studying them until his eyes blurred. Then it clicked. They weren't random. They aligned with old bank ledgers. These weren't numbers meant to identify parts. They were evidence. Evidence tied to stolen Federal Reserve shipments from decades ago, shipments that had vanished without explanation. Marcus's chest tightened. He had read about those stories once in a business magazine. Long ago. Billions in gold, gone without a trace, whispered about in conspiracy circles. And here he was, sitting in a car that might have carried some of it. The Cadillac wasn't just a vault, it was a witness. And if that was true, then the men who lost that gold, or the men who had stolen it, might still be out there. Marcus leaned back in the seat, staring at the roof. For the first time since his fall, he wasn't thinking about his ex-wife or the lies that had ruined him. He wasn't thinking about humiliation or survival. He was thinking about legacy, about how fate had dropped him into the center of a story bigger than himself. But as the weight of that realization sank in, a sound jolted him upright, a soft click. The unmistakable echo of a camera shutter. Marcus froze. His eyes darted to the garage window. A shadow moved. Someone had been watching, photographing. He rushed outside, heart pounding, but the street was empty. Only the faint hum of a car engine fading into the night. He stood there in the cool air, fists clenched, every nerve in his body alive with warning. The Cadillac's secrets were no longer his alone. Someone else knew. And Marcus Ellison's quiet rebirth was about to collide with a storm of history, greed, and power that had been waiting in the dark for decades.